Greetings, Emmett here from Reading for Wisdom. Today we're going to focus on a figure who is probably one of the most notable names associated with one term: propaganda. Now, propaganda is today a very negative word, I think it would be fair to say. Propaganda, the sense that somebody is conveying information or messages to us with the desire to manipulate us, manipulate our minds or feelings for political aims or purely for commercial aims. And propaganda and its use and abuse and how it's disseminated and who uses it and who controls us is probably one of the most important topics of today. The rise certainly of social media, the internet, the holding of media in fewer and fewer and fewer hands, and the sophisticated use of public relations by governments, by corporates, by foreign actors in our domestic affairs has become so great that spotting, understanding and combating propaganda is probably one of the most important things that we as citizens, we as humans should arm ourselves with. And really a key topic of Reading for Wisdom is developing and cultivating a mind to resist propaganda, or certainly to spot it in the first place. Now, the term propaganda is actually, in its original etymology, a relatively neutral term. It just means to spread something, spread information. Not necessarily, as I said, in a pejorative sense. But propaganda really took its negativeness, and propaganda techniques were honed in the 20th century by the two great totalitarian sides, the fascists and the communists. And both of them sharing, of course, a common history, certain common beliefs, very common methods that they all learnt off each other, honed and shaped propaganda right from the revolution, 1917 revolution, right the way through the 20s, the 30s and the 40s, and all the way to the total propaganda of the total war years. And there is a figure who is a giant of propaganda. Now, I don't use the term evil very often. I think it's a much abused term. It's a misused term, and it can be a term that can actually be used almost to gloss over the more important bit is ordinary people and how they can become so brutal, uncaring, and how they can exercise power in certain ways over populations of their own people or of other peoples. But there is a genius of propaganda, and he was quite evil in many ways. He was certainly one of the biggest SOBs of the 20th century, but a fascinating person and somebody whose technique and whose mind we should study. That person, Joseph Goebbels. Now, today what we're actually going to look at is not a history of Goebbels from other people's perspectives. We're not going to look at his writings so much on propaganda or people writing about propaganda. We're going to actually look into the heart of Goebbels himself and his everyday life. And that is through this prism, the Goebbels Diaries, 1939 to 1941. Now, this is a really key, very, very interesting work, and one of the great diaries of that period, in my opinion anyway. And this sort of ranks alongside the diaries of General Alan Brooke, who in a similar way was an accomplished and regular diarist since youth, and had written daily accounts of what was going on. Goebbels' diaries from this period are very much the same. They are a fascinating snapshot into the person's daily life, their thoughts, their beliefs, their interactions with others from their own perspective. Now, there's a little caveat about this volume of Goebbels Diaries that I'll mention at the end. But first of all, a little bit of background about Goebbels the diarist. So Goebbels kept a diary from a fairly young age, so when he was sort of finished his doctoral studies. And Goebbels, it must be remembered, was a top scholar. He was an academic scholar. He had a PhD. Studied philosophy, German philosophy, and studied textual analysis, which I think is quite interesting to see how he managed to understand the human mind, the written word, the film, the audio. And as he was keeping a diary from the early 1920s, Goebbels didn't serve in the First World War. Unlike many of the people like Hitler and Göring, who he went on to be associated with. He had a deformed leg. He wasn't the healthiest person, so missed out on war service. Certainly made up for that for the rest of his life. But he kept a diary from the early 20s and meticulously kept this right the way through to the end. The last known diary entry we have of his is from literally a few days before his death at his own hands, there in the Führer's bunker. But the diaries can be sort of broken up into some distinct periods. There was his early interactions and early flirtations, first with communism. He was actually a communist adherent initially. And then he met up with Hitler, had joined the Nazi Party, and quickly rose to prominence within that party. And his diaries of that period show really the formation of Nazism, the cliques, the infighting. So one of his early sponsors was Gregor Strasser, one of the Strasser brothers, who later came to their end during the Light of the Long Knives, when Hitler had them eliminated. And Strassers were some of the early founders of Nazism, but there was a rivalry with Hitler that only one of them was going to win out on. And so he kept these meticulous diaries, and as he got closer and closer and closer to the seat of power, those diaries start really showing you in dynamic detail what was happening at the time, what the reality of it was, again from his eyes as a chronicler. And he's a pretty honest chronicler of a lot of stuff. Now, it is hard reading these diaries sometimes, particularly when he's ranting and raving about anti-Semitism and Slavs, etc., and his dismissal and real witty and vicious barbs at some of his colleagues and people he faces or interacts with. Once you get that to one side, you do see a relatively honest sort of view on what was happening. Now, the diaries have come to us in a couple of chunks. Some of them are only now being translated from German into English, and this is the one few chunks of those diaries that we have had for some time in English. It is problematic because the source of this transcript, which Fred Taylor translated, came, it is believed, from some East German sources at the time, who removed certain sections about the Soviet, particularly about the Soviet Nazi, the Ribbentrop Pact. And there's sections that strangely are removed all the way throughout this section of the diaries, particularly where it's suspected that they don't make the Soviets and Stalin look particularly good. So there's certainly some holes in it and flaws in it, but overall what we have here is something really valuable. So what about his entries? Well, each diary entry for each day, particularly from the 39 to 41 period, when he was at the height of his powers, Nazi Germany were at the height of their powers. And what we see is, first of all, a really, really busy guy. So unlike, let's say, Goring, who was certainly known for the high life and for partying and maybe not for being the hardest worker, Goebbels certainly was. I mean, you see here the guy getting up first thing in the morning, he's running around the place, meeting with this, putting out fires here, there and everywhere. He's immersed in the effort to control the messages coming out of cinema, radio, approving poster designs, organising rallies, working on the war effort ceaselessly, tirelessly till the end of his day. Let's have a little dip into one of the diary entries so that we get a flavour of what life was in the average day for Joseph Goebbels, Reichsminister for Propaganda and Public Enlightenment. 24th of January 1940, Wednesday. Yesterday, Churchill's threatening speech is going the rounds and arousing the neutrals' outrage. We ignore it. We have no intention of helping out these tiny dwarf states. They deserve to disappear. Detailed talks with Admiral Canaris on espionage and security. There is an enormous amount still to be done in this area. Treason is still too widespread. Security in my ministry is relatively good. But the military shoot their mouths off. Mostly this is mere folie de grandeur. A 4-minute Krupp betrayed many weapon designs to the Poles. It's scarcely believable to see what goes on. We intend to take energetic steps to counter this through education, reinforced by the most severe penalties. Winkler reports on the state of film production. Ufa in a very good position, Terra the same, good at Bavaria, and Wien Film still bad at Tobis. Liechtenstein will probably have to be dismissed. The number of productions at Ufa, Tobis and Terra will be halved. I am looking for a few experienced, able men to handle entertainment film production. Apart from this, we intend to establish a society for electroacoustic research to improve the technical aspects of our films. The money for the party's mobile talking picture shows will come from Winkler. Better, in any case, than letting the finance ministry swallow it. Check through the UFA schedule again. It's not particularly outstanding. Liechtenstein has no perspective and no initiative. He seems to be rather at a loss when it comes to the big problems. Deal with the massive press telegrams. These seem to increase from day to day. I do not even manage to go to the Führer at midday. Mota dead. He was supposed to be a friend of Germany, but in reality he was just a Swiss bourgeois, a head porter type. No loss for us. The Japanese are taking a hard line against the English, who took some 20 Germans off a Japanese ship in Japanese water. Naturally, we stoke the fires. Czech films, bad, run-of-the-mill products. We only have good films and bad films. We lack the serviceable middle range. Savagely cold throughout the ministry, we work in overcoats. Tired and ill. Home. To bed. So that was sort of an average day in the life of a Reichsminister. Busy, busy, busy. And he has so many responsibilities and things to do. Very interesting about film. One of the sort of misconceptions I think that we have about the Nazi period is that they were all focused on producing Leni Riefenstahl triumph of the will style pictures, you know, with these triumphant Aryan types and these great sort of martial processions. One of Goebbels' biggest focuses was on the production of ordinary entertainment films for the German people. Now these of course had to be on message and have very, very subtle meanings throughout them. They were there to really, yes, further the Nazi message, but it wasn't all just about propaganda. A large part of his focus on producing entertainment films was to keep people happy and distracted. So very, very subtle mind, this propagandist. But you can tell the little gossipy style that he has when he's talking about reviewing the day's news, how the war is actually going, how the people are perceiving the war. And, you know, it's the German people he is constantly getting a feeler for, getting a feeler for, getting a feeler for. And one of his great innovations, all the way through, before even getting into power, was reaching to the people and communicating to the people through the press. He was a press publisher in the 1920s. He published newspapers in Berlin that were all very much propaganda pieces. He was a master of directing poster art and design, and certainly under Nazism, poster and agitprop work using that sort of imagery was just masterful. Of course, Goebbels was also one of the great masters of the grand and the magnificent, and we see him orchestrating and directing some of the great symbolisms of Nazi power, the big rallies at Nuremberg, the big state occasions that were totally choreographed. Use of imagery was magnificent, of course, to very, very terrible ends. So he was a very, very talented person. Unfortunately, he put that talent to such evil ends. A notable thing about Goebbels' diaries is that Goebbels himself recognized how important they were. I think it seems that well into the 20s, and certainly once the Nazis had gained power, he realized that his diaries were historically important documents, and he preserved them. Most of them were handwritten up until about 1941. Then from 41 onwards he was dictating them to stenographers, and then finally reverted to handwriting them near the end. And these were microfilmed and kept in various different caches around Germany, and of course some fell into the Soviet hands, some were lost, some sat in archives undiscovered for ages and ages. They're all now not translated, but transcripted into good modern German, and hopefully they'll, more than just the portion that we have in English, will come out over the next couple of years. But as a historic document, they are just fascinating, and the little bits of commentary from Goebbels on day-to-day life, on how the war was actually progressing from the inner viewpoint of the Nazi regime itself, is very instructive, and it's almost a counterweight to some of the mythologizing about Germany under Hitler, and Hitler as the central figure, and Hitler dictating everything, and the belief in Hitler right to the end. Because as you see all the way through this segment, even at the height of the Nazis' powers, Goebbels himself is full of uncertainty. There's lots of doubting around. There's lots of turmoil. The people themselves, the German people and the soldiers, are at ebb points, ups and downs, ups and downs. And the Allied war effort against them, even though the German war effort against the Allies, Britain in particular, had been going so well, they are hurt by the Allies, and hurt by some of the campaigns, particularly the bombing campaign from Bomber Command that Churchill had directed. So you see a very, very nuanced picture of the actuality of life under the regime and within the regime, even at the height of its power. I'm going to read you a long passage from a single day's diary from Goebbels, and it recounts one of the events that for me actually really stands out in this book, and it's the bit when Deputy Führer Hess disappears and reappears in Britain. And how that unfolds over a couple of days is interesting. But when you see the other stuff that was going around at the time in the life of Goebbels, you'll see how complex and complicated and how busy it was to be at the heart of the Nazi war machine. 13th of May, 1941, Tuesday. Yesterday, the devastation in London is, according to all reports on the spot, horrific, but no sign of weakening. English airfields bombed during the night by 300 aircraft in excellent visibility and with every success. The English raid Hamburg and Bremen again, causing some damage to buildings, but little in the way of human casualties. A few sinkings. Attack on Benghazi by English naval units, which is, however, seen off by our Luftwaffe. The shipping losses are the big talking point in London and Washington. There is open discussion of the fact that the English figures do not add up. They are merely a compromise between what they want to admit to us and what they want to tell the Americans. We make grateful use of this satisfying theme. The foreign correspondents are filing sensational stories about coming invasions, etc. I have called them vigorously to order. Stalin is still trying to gain our goodwill, issuing statements filled with simple peasant cunning. Too late! I have noticed a slight element of cynicism creeping into our reporting of the war, particularly the war in the air, which originates at the front. There they are talking about air raids as piecework, among other things. I would put a stop to this. Our people, which has had to suffer so much in this war, would not understand it. I also tone down the grotesque exaggerations, London a sea of flames, which have been putting in an appearance again lately. They can only harm us in the future. We must not arouse hope if they cannot be fulfilled immediately. Our style for this war must be hard, manly, unsentimental, sober, but without smart aleck cleverness. Sarcasm can only harm things. I also put a stop to the current practice of calling all war products German, German tea, German coffee, etc. At this rate, every kind of junk will end up labelled German. This is not good advertising. The Foreign Ministry is against Arabic language clandestine transmitters. I am now establishing them in cooperation with the High Command. They must be created. It is high time. The war is continuing in Iraq. When will the Foreign Ministry finally wake up? The problem of female labour has been shelved yet again by the Führer. I make a vigorous plea for conscription. We shall not get anywhere with fine words. Everything must be subject to clear orders and instructions. Then the German will gladly obey. Our fine ladies will not come voluntarily. The Führer has gone off to Obersalzberg. Calm before the storm. It will not last much longer. Lay down the law to Greener regarding his impossible attitude towards work discipline. He had been looking for an under-secretaryship as his reward. He will wait a very long time for that. Not much can be done with such an old, washed-up official. Appalling news comes in the evening. Hess, against the Führer's orders, has taken off in a plane and has been missing since Saturday. We must presume him dead. His adjutants, who were only ones aware of his intentions, have been arrested under the Führer's orders. The Führer's statement gives delusions as the reason for his action, some madness to do with illusionary peace feelers. The entire effort is thoroughly confused at the moment. We are forced to issue the statement immediately, a hard, almost unbearable blow. At the moment it is impossible to see where this affair will lead. I receive a telephone call from the Berghof. The Führer is quite shattered. What a dreadful sight for the world's eyes. The Führer's deputy, a mentally disturbed man. Dreadful and unthinkable. Now we shall have to grit our teeth. And above all, we shall have to try and shed some light on this totally mysterious affair. At the moment, I can think of no way out, but one will be found. I instruct the press and radio to merely report it without comment, and then wait for the reaction. London will soon have her say, and we shall not be short of a reply. Hess toyed with the idea of a possible peace. It seems that he had become too remote from day-to-day struggle and had turned soft. This business is going to be hard to see through. I immediately have shots of him removed from the latest newsreel. Reuter is still quiet, but the storm will of course break during the next few hours. I am besieged by telephone calls from all over sides. Gauleiters, Reichsleiters, etc. No one wants to believe this madness. It sounds so absurd that it is hard not to dismiss it as a fabrication. The Führer orders that Hess's work in the party chancellery shall be continued as normal. I must go to the Obersalzberg. There I shall hear more details. Nothing can be said on the telephone. A dreadful evening follows. The reports of the inferno in London seem meaningless. I am totally occupied by this matter. Nothing is being spared us. But we shall get through this too, perhaps more quickly than we can conceive at the moment. And so over the next couple of days, in his diaries, we see the Hess story unfold from a moment of sheer panic right at the heart of the Nazi regime. Hitler, his followers, the early Nazis, and it must be remembered that Hess was there from the beginning. Hess was the secretary who, for example, took the dictations for Mein Kampf. For Hess to have done this is a body blow for the Nazis, despite them having the upper hand in the war. So we see this despair going on for a couple of days, until miraculously, through the incompetence of English propaganda, and it's a theme throughout here from Goebbels, he says, you know, my God, these people are not really capitalizing on this moment that they have been given. And 4 days later or 5 days later, he realizes that if a Hess type figure had fallen into his hands, he would have made a great meal of it. But the Brits failed to do that, and the Hess Affair dies down, and then other preoccupations start coming back again. But it is the immediacy of these diaries, the moment by moment ebbs and flows of emotions that are just so illuminating. And even though the weight of war is on him, he is still every day doing his jobs, reviewing certain films, having them edited, even some of the most innocuous films, issuing instructions out to the press, making broadcasts. And of course it's as a broadcaster himself that Hess is most famous, or infamous, we should probably say. Like Hitler, Hess was a very charismatic presenter, speaker, public speaker, orator, and very gifted in those arts. Like Hitler, Hess used to film himself in all of these poses to see what he looked like for dramatic effect when giving speeches. So he was an all-round master of public relations, and certainly it could be said to be the father of the public relations industry. It would be, and thankfully we don't currently live in a time when a Goebbels has control over something like a Facebook. We can only just imagine what social media tools would have been like under Hess, or under Goebbels, pardon me. Frightening. Goebbels, some of the initiatives he brought in, particularly with radio, he made sure that manufacturers, German manufacturers, made cheap radios that were accessible to every German household. And that meant that once he got control, complete control under his own ministry for the radio network in Germany, he was able to broadcast his message into every home. And some of Goebbels' dictums, which are contained in here and elsewhere, you know, repeat a message, repeat a message, repeat a message, and repeat a lie often enough, and not only will people start believing that lie, but you'll actually start believing the lie yourself. So a master of the dark arts he certainly was. There is another side to this diary, which is quite frightening in many ways when you know how it all ended up. And that side is his family side. Now, apart from the fact that Goebbels was a well-known womanizer, he had a string of affairs over the years, and there's all sorts of psychological or psychiatric sort of tracts on why this was that Goebbels was such a womanizer. But regardless, he was, and of course, as the Reichsminister for propaganda, somebody in charge of the film industry, he got to know lots of glamorous and beautiful actresses and folk. But a central, if not the central relationship in his adult life was with Magda Goebbels, his wife. They had a fairly tempestuous relationship, as you can imagine, but they stayed together to the very, very end. And they had quite a few children. I think it was about 6 children in total together. Magda, through a previous marriage, also had an older son who later inherited the family industrial works in 1947, and sort of Joseph Goebbels, one surviving stepson, went on to become one of the largest and richest industrial families in Germany. But that's a discussion for another time. But the Goebbels family, young daughters, one young son, and Goebbels, throughout the diaries, talks about his busy days and the little snatches here and there where he gets to spend time with Magda and with the children. And in those little passages where he describes time with his children, we see, or we seem to see, a doting and loving father. Let's look at one of those day passages, a more relaxing day in the life of the Reichsminister, and a little insight into his thinking about time with his family. 18th of May, 1941, Sunday. Yesterday, a restless night. The village is such a noisy place. The peasants still have no reason to be nervous, and thank God for that. But I scarcely managed to sleep a wink. The Hess Affair is now at an end. I allow another little postscript for foreign consumption, then close the case. Uninteresting. This is how quickly things happen these days. Easy come, easy go. Hess should have realized that before he set out. What will become of him now? Roosevelt is interning French ships and is protesting against the fact that we have declared the Red Sea a war zone. He is talking as if he intended to come to blows with us at any moment. Knox has made another insolent statement. Developments in the USA are becoming grave. We shall wait to see for the present. Big anti-English demonstrations in Syria. General Dentz is doing his duty. Vichy is working well in our interests. I hope that Pétain will stay loyal. A National Socialist organisation has been uncovered in Glasgow. Not very big, but nevertheless interesting as a symptom. Priestley has launched a strong attack on the plutocrats. There are still visions and miracles to be seen. 30 English aircraft over West Germany, middling range on Dusseldorf. We attack key war targets in southern and central England with several hundred aircrafts. Some work. Telephone calls with Fritsch and Hamodsky. Everything is taking its course. To the lake with the children at midday. We spend a happy afternoon in the open air in glorious sunshine. How sweet the children are. I am able to spend hours with them, and I'm very happy and jolly. We build castles and waterfalls. Helmut is busy being architect. He is a real character. The people of Aussie serenade us. It is like peacetime. But despite everything, one senses the shadow of war looming behind all this short-lived contentment. Back to Aussie in the evening. Sollum and Fort Capruzzo, which we had lost, are back in German hands after bitter fighting. Sit with the villagers until late, telling them about the Führer. We all idolize him. As long as he is there, no serious misfortune can befall us. Late to bed. Oh, a proper night's sleep. So we see Goebbels there on a day off from being the Reichsminister. Busy day, but he has time to spend with his sweet, adored children. And I think in all the horror the horror that is war, that is, and that was World War II. One of the horrors for me that is particularly, I don't know, really difficult to grasp, to grip with, to get past, is the Goebbels children and what happened to them. And as many of you will know, Goebbels, loyal to Hitler right to the end, he could see the writing on the wall, and you can get it even at an early stage in the war in these diaries. You can get the sense that he sees what is looming for Germany. And he ended up staying with Hitler till Hitler committed suicide. In Hitler's will, Goebbels became the Führer. So we had two Führers under the Nazis, first Hitler, and for one day, Joseph Goebbels. And during that day, he decided to end it all. Goebbels and Magda, his wife, poisoned the children. So the 6 children were given morphine to put them to sleep. That was administered by Hitler's doctor. They then crushed cyanide capsules in the children's mouths and killed them. And then Goebbels and Magda went out into the Reichschancellery garden and killed themselves. Their bodies were, on their instructions, burnt, but not completely burnt, partially burnt with petrol, and the remains later discovered by the Soviets. Really grim end. And as you read all the talk in these diaries of his loved, so beloved children, and then you picture what he did to them at the end, because as children, as brutal as the Soviets were, they would have been, well, probably not would have killed the kids. There's a good chance that they would have survived and lived to adulthood, but clearly Goebbels didn't see a life for them outside the world that he had helped create and which was burning down around them. And for me that tells you something about Goebbels, because he was a truly horrible man, a genius. There is no doubt about that. He was a hard worker, he was intelligent, he was a real political intriguer, and gosh, Nazi Germany was not one big unified happy family. It was full of intriguers, all plotting and backstabbing each other. And of course that's something that Hitler encouraged, because it made sure that Hitler could keep that grip on power. So, evil genius, a person who invented a lot of the techniques that are in use today, pioneered work in radio, in film, newspaper, documentary style propaganda, in its most overt forms and its most subtle forms, political intriguer. Really recommend this diary. As I said, I think we do have to be a little bit careful. It as a sort of a verbatim account from the diaries that he definitely kept, because this version, as we said earlier, came from dubious sources in East Germany, but the diaries as a whole are a valuable historical record, and an insight, and a rare insight, right from the very heart of one of the most evil regimes, one of the great founding regimes, and by great I don't mean good, I mean just big founding regimes of propaganda, of total war, of total state control over people. And of course there's a character in here who was utterly dedicated to the destruction of the Jewish people, and he pushed for that. So, terrible person, but we can only become wiser about evil when we study it, when we study its practitioners, when we understand them and their motivations. And a really good way to do that is this. This is a gripping read. Actually, I do must say that it's quite grim in places, but its gossipy style propels you along and along and along. Absolutely fascinating. So there we go. A bit of a grim topic for this episode, but I think you'll find a very important one for us to focus on. If you like the type of works that we focus on in this channel, please do give us a like, subscribe, view some of our other videos. Look down below in the links we provide for other sources of information. Come along to our website and keep posted for some new innovations that we'll be bringing to the channel in due course. Thanks for all your support to current subscribers and to the folks supporting us on this channel. Most appreciated, and see you all next time.